Jackie, I want to start with you. When Tim Heaphy was here, I asked him about the significance of Fitton's communications with the White House and how far back they went. I think there's an email somewhere that they presented from the summer before Trump loses in the general. And this was Heaphy's response. The body of evidence slides the timeline back to the summer and an email from Tom Fitton, I think from July, where they're already plotting to call the election rigged. So you could look at Bill Barr's efforts before the election as being part of the incitement. Was it that his testimony after the fact was so valuable that you took everyone willing to make the case against Trump?
What Attorney General Barr did right after the election in authorizing U.S. attorneys to conduct voter fraud investigations before an election was certified, at the time was sort of criticized as helping the president, or it was a partisan move.
Well, it was unprecedented, right?
It was different than prior practice. No, I think he knew going in that there was going to be controversy, that because the president ranting, even before the election, about this is going to be riddled with fraud.
In July,
Exactly right. That there were going to be questions about the legitimacy of the election.
So Barr's conduct, his appearances on media outlets, Fitton's email, all of the groundwork that's laid the summer before the general election takes place and voting in America commences is part of what you would imagine the special counsel's evidence gathering around intent to perpetrate a fraud on the American people to be. What might the and we'll take the two probes because we don't know why Mr. Fitton was there, but we'll take the two probes separately. What might the significance be if he's there answering questions about January 6th, Jackie?
Yeah, Nicole, it's a really good question. Tom Fitton is someone who was not covered as in-depthly as some of the other players during the January 6th Congressional Committee's investigation, but he is someone who is extremely influential. We know that he, in part, co-founded Groundswell with Ginny Thomas, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's wife. And Groundswell is this group of high-powered conservative activists that sort of secretly convened and formed in part to sort of fight the establishment and fight the establishment conservatives from becoming more progressive. And we know in the lead up to January 6th, months before the election was even over, as evidenced in that email that you just mentioned, that Fitton and others were already sort of exploring some of these legal maneuvers to overturn the results of the election or at least delegitimize Joe Biden. In addition, Tom Fitton had and has the former president's ear. He's someone who Trump was listening to, was potentially serving as a liaison to these conservative groups, to people like Ginny Thomas and others who were simultaneously engaging in efforts to get the states to overturn the results of the election by signing on to the fake scheme of electors plan being implemented. So Tom Fitton had his hands in a lot of different plans that were playing out, all in the effort to overturn the results of the election in favor of former President Trump.
And Harry, importantly, to Jackie's reporting, he was part of the premeditation of declaring the result fraudulent and corrupt, regardless of knowing whether or not there was any fraud in the count. It was part of asserting, it's what Trump says to DOJ, just, quote, declare it corrupt and my GOP allies will do the rest. It was part of the premeditation that if he didn't win an overwhelming victory or even a small victory, they would declare the results fraudulent and duke them out in the court. That is Tom Fitton's life. That is what he has done, use the courts to gum up politics.
100%. This guy is quite a character, Nicole. He's actually one of the most prolific tweeters in the country in the whole 8 months leading up to the election, propounding the big lie and other disinformation. And as you say, when all the grown-ups scurry and he has to rely on the likes of Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, he is also is fit in the room. As best I can tell, I don't think this guy is even a lawyer. He's only a conservative activist. And at this point, he was saying all kinds of just declare victory, etc. He also figures centrally in Mar-a-Lago. He's the main guy telling Trump, just say you can declassify anything, etc. And the most intriguing possibility here, raw speculation, but what's been missing to date from the big Trump potential prosecutions are cooperating witnesses. He's someone who potentially could be low enough that he has something to gain, but high enough that he can give good information as to Trump on both, but especially Mar-a-Lago, because he seems to have had conversations with him where where implicitly, at least, Trump would have been knowing that he's not supposed to keep these documents.
So, Donna, and this is so on brand for MAGA world, but he gave his advice on TV. Let me play you the advice that Mr. Fitton gave Donald Trump on the documents case.
I would take the position. I ain't no lawyer, but we've been fighting federal records cases for 30 years at Judicial Watch, that these are personal records. He took them with him as president, as his prerogative is. They're not classified. They're not presidential records. It's all a scam.
I think the raid was a fraud, an abuse, and a sham. There was no good faith basis to target Trump here with this outrageous raid. And all those records he has are his records. And they should stop pretending that just because they think they're presidential records and they think it's classified, you know, that's the final answer, and it ain't.
It's whether or not a president or vice president has the right to take records with him when they leave the White House. And prior to the National Archives and the Biden Justice Department deciding to change precedent, their prior position, and ignore the law and harass Trump, that was what presidents could do.
Now, I mean, obviously what he gets wrong is that what DOJ took to a court who approved the search was 15 months of obstruction of an effort to return the classified documents that were taken with Trump. So he's as much under investigation for obstructing the effort to regain the documents as he is for having them in the first place. But what do you make of his appearance today and what it could possibly signal?
Well, I think that Tom Fitton may indeed have been the Trump whisperer, the silent partner all along, both with respect to Mar-a-Lago, but also laying the foundation for Trump's fake elector scheme, for denying the election, for, you know, sort of holding fast to the idea that he had won and was promoting that. And so I think Harry is right that Tom Fitton may be at just the right level, that he's not willing to do prison time for Donald Trump. And look, he has a history in Judicial Watch, has a long-founded history of litigating and fighting every single thing. And so it's not a surprise to me that he came out swinging like that, but he may indeed be laying the foundation for Trump and showing that there was an intent all along, both on the records, but also on the election scheme.
You know, Jackie, I keep coming back to Tim Heaphy's declarative statement on this show that he doesn't see any outcome other than the criminal prosecution of Donald Trump once they have poured through all the evidence they gather. With the single stipulation being they have more tools than Congress has, they could find evidence that excuses Trump's behavior. He finds that highly unlikely, but leaves that possibility out there. But the idea that they're just now getting to Fitton, does that signal that they're getting to the premeditation? Does that signal that they're getting to everything that was planned before our country had an election and went to the polls?
I mean, I think it does. And I should state that I do really feel like Fitton is potentially just as important and informative to the DOJ in the January 6th investigation as he is with the Mar-a-Lago classified documents investigation. But Tim Heaphy is exactly right. I mean, the DOJ has at their disposal more tools, and the stakes are much higher in terms of actually cooperating with an ongoing criminal investigation. You're going to see, I think, a lot more cooperation, and we already have, than you saw people who just completely ignored some of these subpoenas that were issued by Congress. I do think it's telling that, you know, now some of the people who are coming in are some people who are higher up on the totem pole, who were in direct communication with the president. I am extremely curious to know what the line of questioning is. But again, I do imagine it touched both subjects. I mean, I spoke with Tom Fitton actually in December when we were working on this deep dive about Trump's post-presidency life and sort of the structure he's created that's allowed him to sort of continue to flout norms regularly. And Tom Fitton is a part of that. And, you know, he told me, despite that extended clip that you just played, Nicole, that he wasn't necessarily advocating for Trump to not cooperate with the subpoena, but he felt that the basis of the subpoena was illegitimate and that Trump did not need to, that these records were personal, and that was the legal advice he was providing Trump, despite the fact that he isn't a lawyer. And we do know, and we have previously reported, that the Department of Justice is really interested in learning, you know, what exactly Trump thought and the conversations he had around trying to formulate an external strategy to combat the narrative that was being formed around his refusal to give back these classified documents.